The tension in the congressional hearing room was already suffocating when Governor Greg Abbott adjusted his microphone with a practiced calm. What came out of his mouth next would shock everyone watching and ignite one of the fiercest political clashes in recent memory. "Mr. O'Rourke," Abbott began, his tone icy, every syllable dripping with dismissive authority. "Maybe if you spent less time grandstanding at rallies and more time actually learning how to govern, you'd understand how real policy is made." The room went still. Beto O'Rourke's eyes narrowed with a quiet fire that even veteran political reporters recognized instantly. What unfolded over the next 5 minutes would leave Abbott visibly rattled, damage his carefully cultivated image on live television, and elevate O'Rourke into a symbol of defiance for millions of Texans. This wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was about to become a defining moment where a younger, progressive challenger would strip away the aura of authority from one of Texas's most entrenched leaders. The stakes were monumental. O'Rourke knew that millions of ordinary Texans, families hit by power grid failures, women fighting for their rights, immigrants seeking dignity, would be watching to see if he could withstand the governor's attack. Would he falter under the pressure? Would he lose his composure and hand Abbott the reaction he was fishing for? Or would he turn Abbott's words into a weapon against him, maintaining the sharpness and dignity his supporters expected? Abbott, for his part, looked utterly confident. He had faced down Democrats, activists, and reporters for decades, using calm delivery and ruthless policies to crush opposition. In his mind, dismantling Beto O'Rourke, a man he'd already beaten at the ballot box, would be almost effortless. But what happened next proved that even seasoned power players can miscalculate. The attack was personal. The response would be seismic. And by the end of the day, Greg Abbott's name would be trending across social media for reasons he never anticipated, while Beto O'Rourke's fiery rebuttal would cement his place as one of the boldest voices in Texas politics. What made it even more shocking was the context. This wasn't a campaign rally where heated words might be expected. It was a formal congressional hearing, bound by protocol and standards of decorum. And yet here was Greg Abbott, long a self-proclaimed defender of political civility, launching a deeply personal jab that revealed the very hypocrisy he accused others of. Power and privilege have a way of exposing true character, and Abbott's was about to be revealed in the most brutal way possible. Governor Greg Abbott sat at the witness table with the quiet authority of someone who had ruled Texas politics for decades. At 66 years old, Abbott was no stranger to power. His resume read like a Republican stronghold. Long-serving Attorney General of Texas, multiple terms as governor, and the figurehead behind some of the most sweeping conservative policies in the nation. To his supporters, he was a symbol of steadfast leadership. To his critics, he was the architect of policies that had rolled back rights and left ordinary Texans vulnerable. But years of victories had made Abbott overconfident. He'd grown accustomed to the deference that came with being the most powerful man in Texas, someone who could lecture opponents about governance simply because he held the highest office in the state. His Navy suit was immaculate, his delivery calm, his tone carrying the unspoken weight of establishment privilege. To Abbott, this congressional hearing was just another platform to assert dominance, another stage where he could showcase his command of policy and dismiss critics with practiced ease. Abbott had always thrived in these environments: committee rooms, press briefings, private strategy sessions with donors. He had perfected the art of sounding reasonable while undercutting his opponents with carefully chosen words. For years, that formula worked. His deliberate calm, his carefully measured phrasing, his aura of inevitability had shut down critics before they ever gained traction. But this time, Abbott underestimated his opponent. He assumed that Beto O'Rourke, his old rival, the man he'd beaten at the ballot box, would fold under the same dismissive tactics. Abbott saw what he wanted to see: a loud idealist with more passion than substance, someone easy to belittle, someone who couldn't match the gravitas of a sitting governor. What he didn't realize was that O'Rourke had been preparing for this moment long before the cameras ever started rolling. The hearing centered on voting rights legislation, and Abbott had been called to testify on election integrity. For 20 minutes, he spoke in rehearsed phrases about safeguarding democracy, all while sidestepping accusations of voter suppression in Texas. Then O'Rourke leaned forward, eyes sharp, and began asking pointed, uncompromising questions. That's when the governor's mask started to crack. What the audience at home couldn't see was the preparation behind O'Rourke's questions. His team had spent weeks combing through Abbott's speeches, legislative records, and legal briefs. They had binders filled with contradictions, data on disenfranchised communities, and receipts from policies that cut early voting access. O'Rourke's chief of staff had warned him beforehand. Abbott will try to dismiss you. He'll make it personal. He'll aim to paint you as emotional or reckless. Don't fall for it. But O'Rourke wasn't planning to take the bait. He had a different strategy, one that would expose not just Abbott's policies, but the very contradictions in his image as Texas's unshakable leader. If he wants to make it personal, Beto told his team before the hearing, then we'll show him what personal really means. We'll show the difference between someone who fought their way here and someone who's always had the system at his back. Earlier, Governor Abbott had leaned into the microphone with cold authority. "With all due respect, Congressman," he said, his tone carrying none, "you're new to this. Some of us have been protecting Texas values since before you could vote." The condescension was unmistakable, but it was about to backfire. Across from Abbott sat 40-something Beto O'Rourke, the opponent Abbott had underestimated for years. Born and raised in El Paso, Beto hadn't been born into a political dynasty. His parents weren't Washington power brokers. He built his career from the ground up, serving on the El Paso City Council, then in Congress, and fighting statewide campaigns that brought him face-to-face with ordinary Texans in every corner of the state. What Abbott dismissed as inexperience was actually O'Rourke's greatest strength. He had lived among the people Abbott's policies so often overlooked. The long nights on the campaign trail, the countless town halls, the losses and near misses. Those weren't scars, they were lessons. They had shaped him into something Abbott could never truly understand, a fighter who knew what it meant to keep standing when the odds were against him. Beto had earned every inch of his platform, not by inheriting power, but by walking street to street, listening to people who felt left behind. Sitting there in his slim-cut navy suit, sleeves rolled just enough to signal he was ready for a fight, O'Rourke embodied everything the old Republican Guard feared. A younger, relentless, progressive voice who wasn't impressed by Abbott's calm authority or his deep donor network. He'd dealt with men like Abbott before, on debate stages, where the governor tried to reduce him to sound bites, in interviews when critics mocked his passion as weakness, in campaigns when veteran strategists dismissed him as a one-term novelty. But each encounter had taught O'Rourke something vital. The way to deal with bullies wasn't to rage or snap. It was to let them expose themselves, then dismantle them methodically with facts, conviction, and a moral clarity they couldn't match. For Abbott, this was supposed to be routine. Belittle the challenger, establish dominance, and move on. He had done it countless times before. For O'Rourke, this was about more than legislation. It was about the millions of Texans who had endured grid failures, women stripped of their rights, immigrants demonized, and working families left behind. This wasn't just his fight, it was theirs. The room was packed with reporters. C-SPAN cameras were rolling and social media was already buzzing about the tension. What began as a routine hearing was about to turn into a defining moment in Texas politics. And Greg Abbott had no idea what was about to hit him. The sparks began when O'Rourke pressed Abbott on Texas's voting restrictions. He had done his homework. He came armed with statistics, legal rulings, and real-life examples of Texans who had been turned away from the polls or forced to drive hours just to cast a ballot. These weren't abstract hypotheticals. These were the lived experiences of Abbott's own constituents. But Abbott wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in showing who controlled the room. "Congressman O'Rourke," Abbott interrupted, raising his hand in a cool, dismissive gesture, "you're talking about isolated incidents. Those of us who actually understand how elections are run know that these measures are necessary to preserve integrity." The phrase "those of us" came with a practiced smirk, a signal that O'Rourke didn't belong to the governor's exclusive club of power brokers. A few Republican committee members chuckled, as if Abbott had put his former rival in his place. But O'Rourke didn't flinch. "Governor Abbott, are you suggesting I don't understand how elections work? Because I've been through 3 of them across this state, and I did it without limiting ballot boxes or cutting early voting days." The temperature in the chamber rose. Abbott's jaw tightened, but he pressed forward, enjoying what he believed was an easy target. He leaned back in his chair with the composure of a man who'd never truly been forced to answer. "Look," Abbott said, voice steady, "I've been safeguarding Texas elections since before you held your first office. I've seen every trick, every loophole, every excuse. What you're describing isn't suppression. It's making sure only qualified voters cast ballots." O'Rourke leaned in. Qualified according to whom? His voice carried a razor edge, sharp enough to make seasoned reporters sit up straighter. That was when Abbott's smile faltered, and then soured. Here came his fatal mistake. Instead of sticking to policy, he decided to go personal. "Congressman," Abbott said, his tone dropping into a condescending register, "the real problem is that you're letting your personal frustrations cloud your objectivity. Not everyone is raised in a way that teaches proper respect for institutions." The room froze. Every microphone captured it. Every camera zoomed in. A hush fell over the chamber. Even the Republican committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Governor Abbott had crossed a line that seasoned politicians knew was dangerous. He'd made it personal, not about policy, but about someone's family, someone's upbringing, someone's very right to belong at the table. But Abbott wasn't finished. Mistaking O'Rourke's measured silence for hesitation, he pushed further, digging himself into political quicksand. "Let's be honest here," Abbott said smoothly. "Some of us were raised with a strong foundation of civic duty and respect for law and order. Others seem to think passion and personal grievances are the same thing as leadership." The coded message wasn't subtle. It was a dog whistle so loud the entire room heard it. He was painting O'Rourke as reckless, emotional, unfit. It was the kind of dismissal that had been thrown at young reformers for generations. But Abbott's delivery gave it the chilling edge of arrogance. The cameras caught every second. Social media lit up instantly. Abbott was trending within minutes, and not in a good way. Cable news producers scrambled to prep live cut-ins. What had started as another dry committee hearing had just turned into the political story of the day. The contrast was impossible to miss. On one side sat Greg Abbott, representing everything critics loathed about establishment politics: coded language, insider smugness, the presumption that connections and tradition outweighed character and competence. On the other sat Beto O'Rourke, representing the wave of change millions of Texans had rallied behind. Authentic, relentless, unafraid to speak truth to power. For a moment, O'Rourke sat in silence. But anyone who knew him could see the storm building in his eyes. He'd been dismissed like this before, on debate stages, in interviews, in campaign stops where skeptics rolled their eyes. But this time was different. This time the cameras were rolling. This time he had a national platform. And this time Abbott had just made the biggest miscalculation of his political career. "Governor Abbott," O'Rourke said, his voice measured, calm, dangerously calm, "I want to be absolutely clear. Are you suggesting that because I wasn't born into privilege, my perspective is somehow deficient?" Abbott, blind to the danger, doubled down. "I'm suggesting," he replied, "that different upbringings create different worldviews, and some worldviews are more grounded in traditional Texas values than others." The committee chairman, sensing the looming explosion, tried to step in. "Perhaps we should return to the substance of the legislation." But Abbott waved him off. No, I think this is important. Congressman O'Rourke raised questions about qualifications, and the American people deserve to understand where those questions are really coming from." He turned back toward O'Rourke with the same thin, condescending smile. "I had the benefit," Abbott declared smoothly, "of learning civic duty and responsible governance from parents who instilled in me stability, discipline, and respect for authority. That foundation shapes how I approach policy. Perhaps that's why we see things differently." The implication was unmistakable. Beto O'Rourke hadn't been raised with the right values. His community hadn't given him proper guidance. He was somehow lesser because his path hadn't been carved by privilege. But what Abbott didn't realize, what men like him rarely realized, was that he wasn't saying anything O'Rourke hadn't heard before. These weren't fresh attacks. They were the same tired tropes that had been thrown at reformers, activists, and ordinary Texans for generations. The assumption that if you didn't come from wealth, you lacked values. That if you questioned authority, you lacked respect. That if you struggled, you were somehow inadequate. What Abbott failed to see was that every time those dismissive barbs had been aimed at O'Rourke in the past, they had only strengthened him. Every snide remark from seasoned insiders, every time someone rolled their eyes at his grassroots campaigns, every attempt to write him off as naive, those moments had fueled him to push harder, dig deeper, and stand taller. Now, in this congressional hearing with the nation watching, Abbott was about to learn what happened when those same old weapons were turned on someone who had spent years building immunity to them. His words weren't just patronizing, they were classist, they were elitist, they were everything Texans were growing tired of, wrapped up neatly in the polite cadence of establishment politics. The moment crystallized a deeper divide that had been simmering in American politics for years. On one side was the old guard, embodied by a powerful governor who had spent decades shielded by privilege and institutions. On the other was a challenger forged in the grit of retail politics, someone who had fought for every yard of progress, someone who knew what it meant to stand in the hot Texas sun listening to families who felt abandoned by the very leaders sworn to protect them. For decades, the old playbook had worked. Question someone's legitimacy, drag their background into the debate, force them to defend their right to even have a voice. But this time, the target wasn't playing defense. This time, the target was prepared. This time, intelligence met conviction. And this time, Beto O'Rourke was about to show the country what happens when you put privilege up against persistence. Slowly, deliberately, O'Rourke rose from his chair. The movement was controlled, precise, and it made every person in the room fall silent. The storm had arrived. When he spoke, Beto's voice carried the calm weight of someone who had been underestimated his entire life and was about to remind everyone why that was a mistake. "Governor Abbott," he began, his tone steady, almost quiet but sharper than any shout. "Since you've decided to make this about upbringing and values, let me tell you about mine." Abbott shifted slightly in his chair. This wasn't the response he'd been expecting. "I was raised in El Paso, Texas, not in the corridors of power, not in a family with deep political connections. My father wasn't a lobbyist or a donor. My mother wasn't hosting galas for the wealthy and well-connected. My parents taught me something much simpler, much harder, that if you wanted to change your community, you had to show up. You had to knock on doors. You had to listen. You had to earn trust." The room was completely silent now. Even the reporters stopped typing. "My parents didn't teach me that respect comes from a title. They taught me that respect is earned by service, that integrity isn't measured by how comfortably you live, but by how many people's lives you make better." And when I started in local politics, serving on the El Paso City Council, I learned firsthand what real leadership looks like. It looks like answering calls at midnight about a broken streetlight. It looks like sitting with families who can't pay their rent. It looks like showing up every single day for the people who elected you. Beto's voice rose, not in anger but in pride. "That's why I fought to expand healthcare access. That's why I stood up against policies that punished immigrants instead of protecting them. That's why I ran for Congress. And yes, that's why I ran for governor. And let me tell you, Governor Abbott, I didn't get there because someone cleared the path for me. I got there by outworking, out-hustling, and out-listening to the people you so often ignore." He began to walk slowly toward the witness table. Abbott, for the first time, leaned back ever so slightly. "You sit here in your tailored suit, talking about traditional Texas values as if you own them. But the truth is, those values don't belong to the powerful. They belong to the people who work 2 jobs to keep the lights on. They belong to the teachers grading papers past midnight. They belong to the nurses pulling double shifts, to the farm workers breaking their backs in the sun, to the families who survived the blackout while the wealthy bought backup generators." Now Beto stood directly across from Abbott, looking down at him. "So when you tell me that my perspective isn't grounded in the right values, here's what I hear. I hear a man who's had every door open for him lecturing someone who had to knock on every single one just to get inside. I hear privilege trying to pass itself off as wisdom. And I hear the very reason why Texans are demanding change." The silence in the room was electric. Abbott, who had begun the hearing with complete control, suddenly looked much smaller than he had when this all started. The committee room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras. "You want to talk about values, Governor Abbott?" O'Rourke's voice cut through the silence, calm but sharp as a blade. "Let's actually talk about your values. Osabamin Mshias. You're the man who built a career on divide and conquer politics. You're the man who signed laws that stripped women of the right to make decisions about their own bodies. You're the man who allowed millions of Texans to freeze in their homes during the grid collapse while your donors profited from the disaster." Beto reached for a thick folder that had been sitting on his desk all along. He flipped it open deliberately, the sound of the paper echoing in the silent chamber. "Since you've decided to question qualifications, let's review your record." He began reading. "You've pushed some of the strictest voter restrictions in the country, policies that a federal court ruled intentionally discriminated against minority voters. You signed off on redistricting maps that silenced communities of color. You weakened gun safety laws even after children were massacred in their classrooms. And you've consistently sided with corporate interests over working Texans." Abbott's face tightened, his jaw clenching. But O'Rourke pressed on, his voice rising with righteous precision. "So let's compare our values, Governor. My parents taught me that truth matters. You've built a career dodging accountability. My community taught me to fight for people who don't have a voice. You've built a career ignoring them. My campaign was powered by ordinary Texans giving $5 at a time. Yours has been funded by billionaires and lobbyists who expect something in return." O'Rourke stepped closer to the witness table, placing both hands firmly on the wood. Abbott actually leaned back in his chair, visibly unsettled. "The difference between us, Governor Abbott, is simple. I earned my place here. You inherited yours through a system built to protect the powerful. And here's what really bothers me about what you said. You didn't just dismiss me, you dismissed every Texan who's ever struggled to pay their bills. You dismissed every family who's ever sat in the dark during a blackout, wondering if their children would make it through the night. You dismissed every young person who's ever been told their voice didn't matter. You dismissed every immigrant family who came here with nothing but the hope of building a better life, only to have politicians like you slam the door in their faces." His voice filled the chamber now, steady but electric, righteous fury channeled into unshakable clarity. "My community may not have had money, Governor Abbott, but we had something you clearly never learned: decency. My parents would never demean someone's family to score political points. They would never use power to punch down at people who had less. They would never call cruelty a value." The silence that followed was deafening. Reporters' fingers hovered above keyboards, the weight of the moment sinking in. Abbott, who had begun the hearing with his trademark composure, suddenly looked very small beneath the gaze of the man standing before him. O'Rourke straightened up, his gaze locking directly into the C-SPAN cameras. "So yes, Governor Abbott, my upbringing was different from yours. I wasn't raised in privilege. I was raised by parents who taught me that character is measured by how you treat people who can do nothing for you. I was raised to believe that public service means serving the public, not serving yourself. I was raised to understand that real strength doesn't come from tearing others down, but from lifting them up." He turned back to Abbott, who sat frozen at the witness table, staring downward, unable to meet his eyes. "And if that's not what you consider Texas values, then maybe the problem isn't with my upbringing. Maybe the problem is with your understanding of what Texas and what America is supposed to be about." The room erupted. Democratic committee members broke into applause. A few Republicans shifted uneasily, their discomfort written plainly across their faces. Reporters' keyboards clattered furiously, desperate to capture every word. And Greg Abbott, the man who had entered with unshakable confidence, sat there in silence, utterly dismantled by the rival he had once dismissed as an afterthought. It was over. In less than 10 minutes, Beto O'Rourke hadn't just defended himself. He had exposed Abbott as exactly what millions of Texans already feared he was: an insulated, out-of-touch politician clinging to power while ordinary people suffered. And O'Rourke had done it with grace, clarity, and a conviction rooted not in privilege, but in lived experience. The committee chairman sat stunned for a full 30 seconds before remembering to restore order. When he finally called for quiet, the damage was already done. Abbott, the man who had spent decades defining himself as unflappable, couldn't even raise his eyes from the table. I think we should move on to other questions, the chairman stammered, clearly unsure how to follow the wreckage left behind. But O'Rourke wasn't done. He leaned forward once more. Actually, Mr. Chairman, I think Governor Abbott should be given the opportunity to respond to my comments about his record. After all, he seemed very eager to discuss personal backgrounds just a few minutes ago. Every eye turned to Abbott, the politician who had built his career on never backing down, on projecting strength, on using sharp words to dominate his opponents. Now all of that was gone. "Governor?" the chairman prompted. Finally, Abbott looked up. His face was pale, his trademark composure shattered. The smirk was gone. I think Congressman O'Rourke has made his point," he said softly. It was a complete surrender. No counterpunch, no spin, no attempt to claw back the narrative. Greg Abbott had been intellectually and morally dismantled in front of the nation, and everyone in that room knew it. Within minutes, social media erupted. The clip was spreading like wildfire, shared faster than servers could keep up. Beto O'Rourke shot to the top of trending topics nationwide. Right behind him was Dark Abbott, but for all the wrong reasons. The contrast was devastating. Abbott's smug dismissal of O'Rourke's background, followed by O'Rourke's dignified, devastating rebuttal. The optics were clear. Abbott looked like what many had long suspected, a privileged bully who had finally picked a fight with someone who refused to bow down, and who had the skill, the preparation, and the courage to fight back. Conservative Twitter scrambled into damage control mode. Party loyalists rushed to soften the blow, but even many Republicans were quietly distancing themselves from Abbott's remarks. "This isn't who we are," one GOP strategist posted. Personal attacks on someone's background have no place in political discourse. Meanwhile, Democrats and progressive organizations were reveling in the moment. "This is what it looks like when real Texas values take on corruption," read one viral tweet, shared more than 100,000 times. But the most powerful responses didn't come from politicians or pundits. They came from ordinary Texans who saw themselves reflected in O'Rourke's story. Single parents shared their struggles raising families on tight budgets. First-generation college graduates described years of being underestimated. Essential workers, immigrants, and young voters all spoke up about facing the same kind of dismissal Abbott had just displayed. Political commentators across the spectrum called it one of the most devastating takedowns they had ever witnessed. CNN's chief political analyst said, "I've covered politics for 30 years, and I've never seen someone's composure collapse so completely in such a short time." Fox News found itself in an impossible bind, defending Abbott without appearing to defend his attack on working families. Their primetime hosts tried to pivot to other aspects of the hearing, but even they couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. MSNBC, meanwhile, ran the clip on repeat every hour. "This is what happens when old guard politics collides with new energy," one host declared. Abbott came armed with condescension. O'Rourke came armed with facts, with authenticity, with moral clarity. The Washington Post editorial pulled no punches. Greg Abbott's remarks reveal everything broken in today's Republican politics. The presumption that privilege equals virtue, that struggle equals weakness, and that attacking someone's story is a substitute for defending your record. Behind the scenes, Republican leadership was furious. Abbott's comments hadn't just misfired, they had handed Democrats a pristine example of elitism and hypocrisy. Phone calls were made, emergency meetings convened, and frantic damage control strategies drafted. But it was far too late. The clip was everywhere. No amount of spin could erase what millions had just witnessed with their own eyes. Greg Abbott, the longtime face of Texas conservatism, attacking a rival for not being born into privilege, and being utterly dismantled in response. Some Republicans tried to defend Abbott, insisting that his remarks had been taken out of context, but the full video told the story plainly. There was no context that could excuse what he said or the way he said it. Others pivoted, claiming that O'Rourke's response had been too emotional, too fiery for a congressional hearing. That strategy backfired almost instantly when clips resurfaced of these same Republicans praising male politicians for much harsher and far less controlled outbursts in similar settings. For Democrats, it was a dream scenario. They couldn't have scripted it better if they'd tried. Here was Beto O'Rourke, a younger, progressive voice from Texas with a working-class narrative, showcasing exactly the kind of moral clarity and authenticity the party had been desperate to project. His defense of ordinary Texans, struggling families, and the dignity of every voter hit every note Democratic strategists had been aiming to strike for years. Within hours, House Democratic leadership released a statement. Congressman O'Rourke's response today exemplifies the values and integrity Americans expect from their elected officials. His story of perseverance and service to the people is the American dream in action. Progressive groups went even further. Beto O'Rourke just showed the country what real strength looks like, posted one major organization. While Abbott tried to tear him down, O'Rourke lifted up every Texan who's ever been told they don't matter. The praise spread beyond politics. Actors, musicians, athletes, and even rival politicians amplified the clip. "This is what courage looks like," tweeted one A-list actress. A well-known comedian quipped, "When they go low, he goes higher, but he also brings the receipts." Even some unexpected voices joined in. A former Republican strategist tweeted, "I disagree with O'Rourke on nearly every policy, but what he did today was masterful. Abbott was completely out of line, and O'Rourke handled it with more dignity than he deserved." The moment had transcended partisan lines. It wasn't just Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It was decency versus cruelty, authenticity versus calculation, earned respect versus inherited power. The confrontation had implications far beyond Abbott's immediate embarrassment. It underscored a generational and cultural shift taking hold in American politics. The era when establishment figures could rely on coded language and intimidation was ending. A new generation, unafraid to call it out and armed with both moral authority and digital platforms, was rising to meet them head-on. And for Beto O'Rourke, the exchange transformed him from a persistent challenger into something larger, a national political force. O'Rourke's email list exploded with new subscribers overnight. Speaking requests poured in from across the country. Democratic donors who had barely known his name before were suddenly writing checks to his campaign. But beyond the money and the attention, he had proven something far more important, that the new generation of Democratic leaders could not only withstand attacks from the Republican establishment, they could turn those attacks into defining moments of moral leadership. For Greg Abbott, the damage was deep and lasting. Invitations to speak at national conferences were quietly withdrawn. Television bookings dwindled. The governor who had built his brand on unflappable discipline had committed one of the most unforced, strategic blunders of modern political history. His allies tried to spin it, calling him a brilliant leader who'd simply had a bad day. But the viral clip made that impossible. The truth was undeniable. Abbott had revealed himself as exactly the kind of out-of-touch elitist many Texans had grown tired of. The man who prided himself on discipline and control had lost both in the worst possible moment. The confrontation reverberated beyond politics. It became a cultural moment that spoke to bigger questions of class, dignity, and respect in America. O'Rourke's defense of ordinary Texans struck a chord with millions who had faced the same kind of dismissive treatment their whole lives. Teachers shared the clip with students as an example of how to respond to bullies with facts, courage, and composure. Parents showed it to their children as proof that you don't need wealth or privilege to stand tall, that you can face down power with nothing more than truth and conviction. Young people saw it as inspiration that no matter where you start, you can fight your way into the arena if you work hard enough. What made O'Rourke's response so powerful wasn't just that he had defended himself, it was that he had defended everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough because of where they came from. He had taken Abbott's attempt to diminish him and transformed it into a celebration of resilience, hard work, and dignity. In a political climate poisoned with negativity and division, Beto O'Rourke had delivered something rare. A moment of genuine inspiration that reminded people why they cared about politics in the first place. He had shown that sometimes the most devastating answer to an attack isn't to attack back. It's to stand up, tell your truth, and let your values speak louder than any insult. And he had done it all with the same grace, grit, and decency that his community in El Paso had instilled in him years ago. What made the victory even more striking was how completely O'Rourke had controlled the narrative. From the moment Abbott launched his attack, O'Rourke had been 3 steps ahead, methodically building his rebuttal while letting the governor dig himself deeper with every smug word. By the time it was over, the balance of power in that room, and perhaps in Texas politics, had shifted. Abbott had entered as the unshakable governor. He left as a diminished man. O'Rourke had entered as an underdog. He left as a national political force. O'Rourke hadn't lost his temper. He hadn't resorted to cheap insults. He hadn't stooped to Abbott's level. Instead, he had turned Abbott's own weapons against him. His smug sense of superiority, his coded dismissals, his attempt to diminish someone based on background. Every weakness Abbott tried to weaponize became a testament to O'Rourke's resilience. Every struggle Abbott mocked became proof of O'Rourke's determination. In the end, Greg Abbott was not defeated by shouting or aggression. He was undone by the truth. The truth about his record, the truth about his values, and the truth about what real strength looks like when tested by privilege and power. If you thought watching Beto O'Rourke dismantle Greg Abbott's arrogant attack was powerful, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Political moments like this don't happen every day, but when they do, you'll want to be the first to see them. This confrontation proved that in American politics, truth and authenticity still matter. When elites try to use someone's background as a weapon, sometimes they discover that background is actually their opponent's greatest strength. What did you think of O'Rourke's response? Was it too much or exactly what Abbott deserved? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what real political courage looks like. The clash between the old guard and the new generation of leaders is its only beginning. And if this showdown is any indication, the battles ahead are going to be riveting. Moments like these remind us why representation matters, why diverse voices in politics are essential, and why we can never take democracy for granted. As we follow Beto O'Rourke's career and the ongoing transformation of Texas and American politics, one thing is certain: the days when powerful men could silence opposition with personal attacks and elitist arrogance are coming to an end. The future belongs to leaders who can stand tall, speak truth, and fight back with facts, dignity, and unshakable moral authority. Stay tuned, because when politics gets personal, truth gets powerful.